Welcome back. Last year, the Center for Defense and Strategic Studies, which is affiliated with Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps, outlined possible scenarios in the event of an attack on Tehran. These include striking U.S. military installations in the region using missiles, closing the Hormuz Strait, halting its own oil exports, and firing Shahab-3 missiles towards Israel. Well, joining us again from Cairo, Joel Bainan, Professor of Middle East History at Stanford University. From London, Bakr Moeen, Director of Jadid Media. And on the phone from Washington, D.C., Patrick Clausen, Deputy Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Mr. Clausen, how likely is a U.S. air campaign against Iran, and would it be nuclear?
The United States has been reasonably satisfied with the progress of international diplomacy against Iran's nuclear program. And, of course, the United States and Iran are sitting to discuss the situation in Iraq along with the Iraqi authorities. So on the two major issues separating the two sides, there have been real efforts by the U.S. administration to emphasize diplomacy. And only if that diplomacy were to break down could we imagine there being some kind of discussion about whether or not to preempt Iran's nuclear capabilities or to preempt those in Iran who are training and arming the militias and insurgents inside Iraq. And so it would only be if the Iranian government were to do something foolish. Unfortunately, President Ahmadinejad of Iran is the kind of overconfident person who could do something foolish. But personally, I'm an optimist. I don't think that's likely to happen anytime soon.
But, sir, critics would say that the U.S. is being foolish by wanting to designate the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, as a terrorist organization. That would be a blatant provocation of Iran. What do you think of that?
Well, the blatant provocation is the Revolutionary Guards providing weapons that are killing Americans, and that is quite a problem. And the Revolutionary Guards are quite proud of the role they play in providing weapons to be used by terrorist organizations in Lebanon and in Gaza and the West Bank. And the United States has been quite restrained in its response to this to date, and I suspect it will continue to be quite restrained in its response. That is to say, it will consult with its European allies. During the crises in the former Yugoslavia, the European Union and the United States took strong action against many Serbian entities that were supporting terrorism there, even though we had to do it outside the United Nations framework. And I suspect that it may be necessary to follow that model again with respect to Iran, because it looks like the Chinese especially, but also to some extent the Russians, are not prepared to follow through with a new resolution at the United Nations about Iran.
Bakr Moeen, for whatever their reasons may be, what do you think the consequences will be if the United States does attack Iran's nuclear facilities?
Well, it's very difficult to predict because the decision-making bodies within Iran is not only Revolutionary Guard. There are other bodies. Iran is a kind of confederation of various institutions, and they have to come to a consensus among themselves for a response. I think they would be restrained. I think if that happens, they will have to decide whether they want to move further and make the whole crisis into a major international crisis, or they want to limit it. My impression is that to begin with, they will be fairly restrained. Depends what the Americans are going to do as their second move, or at least the Iranians will try to read their second move. But my feeling is that if that is going to happen, if there is going to be any attack on Iran, it will have both regional as well as international consequences.
Joel Bainan, a little bit earlier on Thursday, just a few hours ago, we heard some positive things from the IAEA regarding Iran's nuclear program. However, would further United Nations Security Council sanctions over the nuclear program help or hinder prospects for peace?
This is a very difficult question. The Iranian regime maintains that it has the right to enrich uranium. That in and of itself isn't a violation of Iran's treaty obligations. The problem in the past has been that Iran has concealed what it has been doing, even though what it had been doing was not particularly a violation of the treaties. So there's justifiable concern, and if the IAEA actually confirms that Iran is beginning to cooperate fully and to follow through on its promises to do so, that would be entirely positive. I don't think that the question of Iran's nuclear capability is actually the main issue between the United States and Iran. It is an issue. It's of significance. I don't want to brush it aside. But the real issue, I think, is what Bakr Moin said earlier. Iran is a large country, large population, big army, has considerable industrial capacity, even if it's not being mobilized in the most effective way now. And Iran is going to be a powerful force in the Gulf region. And the United States, for its part, believes that it has interests in the Gulf, which are, in a word, oil. And therefore, there has been a confrontation between Iran and the United States going all the way back to the early 1950s when President Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil, and then the CIA came in and undertook a coup d'etat to reverse the oil nationalization. So then you had an interlude when there was not conflict because of the Shah and his close relationship to the United States.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir. I just want to, on the issue of oil, Iran has threatened that it would shut the Strait of Hormuz and halt oil exports. Do you think that will create shockwaves across the world if it is attacked and it responds in this way?
It will certainly increase the price of oil on the global market considerably, and that would be a pretty big shock for the global economy.
Mr. Clausen, are we at the point of no return, or are you optimistic that the US and Iran can still sit together and use each other to try and stabilize Iraq, or is that not on the table?
It does not appear that the Iranian government regards a stable Iraq that is friendly to the United States as being in Iran's interests. And that calculation that the Iranians have made is not one that the United States is likely to persuade the Iranians to abandon. After all, the Iranians, for whatever reasons, have arrived at that viewpoint, and it's not likely that the Iranians are going to regard Washington as having a better grasp of where Iran's interests lie than the Iranian officials themselves have. And so it would appear that the Iranians have decided, the Iranian government officials have decided that they do not want a stable Iraq if it's going to be friendly to the United States. That's unfortunate, but that's a reality that's not likely to change.
So do you believe that the United States' overall objective is regime change in Iran, no matter what, whether it's military or not?
And the United States would be delighted if there were a regime change in Iran, but that's to say the United States is not actively trying to do very much about this. The U.S. efforts to broadcast to Iran are regarded by the Iranian regime as part of an effort to have a soft velvet revolution which will undercut their regime. It seems to be so paranoid about their hold on power that they think that with the slightest little push they can be shoved out of power. I actually think that they're more firmly in power than that. So the United States would be delighted if there were a change in regime, but doesn't expect one anytime soon.
Bakr Moin, some would say that that's the very crux of Western hypocrisy, wanting regime change in Iran. What do you make of that?
I think the West naturally would love to see a regime change in Iran. My feeling is that they know is not realistic, at least in the short run is not realistic. My feeling is that over Iraq they can reach an understanding provided they agree on a number of factors. Number one is that they really want the unity of Iraq. Second, they want a stable government. But on the third issue, which is the future of Iraqi government that can be turned against Iran, the Iranians are worried about that the West would like to create another Saddam Saddam Hussein that would be hostile to Iran because they think they have to create a counterbalance to control Iran. That is where the problem is about, I think. And also the best approach would be, if there is any possibility, that both will have to understand and appreciate each other's long-term strategic interest. Americans have got interest in the Persian Gulf. I think the Iranians have got also interest across the region, and they have to have an understanding of win-win situation. Unless they reach in that position, I think the current tension will continue.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's a fascinating discussion. We can go on for hours on end. Joel Bainan, Bakr Ma'in, and Patrick Clausen. It's really been interesting discussing this issue with you. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Bye-bye.